Imagine finding out that for centuries, we've had only a sliver of access to one of the most potent spiritual tools ever recorded in human history. While billions worldwide pray for answers, yearn for miracles, there's a hidden treasure few have ever glimpsed. A specific prayer Jesus Christ himself used before performing his most extraordinary acts. This isn't some ancient riddle lost to the sands of time. It's been meticulously preserved in one of early Christianity's most ancient and complete texts, the Ethiopian Bible. The Ethiopian Christian tradition, among the oldest on earth, has safeguarded elements within its sacred scriptures that were either excised, censored, or simply overlooked by other Christian traditions over the centuries. While the biblical canon we recognize today underwent countless councils, translations, and reinterpretations, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church meticulously held onto original texts dating back to the very first centuries of Christianity. These texts include intimate details about Jesus' spiritual practices, details rarely, if ever, broached from modern American pulpits. What makes this discovery even more compelling isn't just another beautiful prayer or inspiring verse. We're talking about a specific spiritual formula, a precise invocation Jesus employed to tap into the divine power needed to heal the sick, raise the dead, multiply food, and fundamentally alter physical reality. This wasn't some casual, impromptu plea. It was a deliberate, structured practice, adhering to profound spiritual principles that connected the human to the divine in an extraordinary way. Ever wonder why some prayers seem answered in an instant, while others remain unheard for years? Why some folks experience constant miracles, while others futilely battle seemingly immutable circumstances? The answer might just lie in this lost prayer, in the knowledge preserved by the Ethiopians, but largely overlooked by the rest of the Christian world. Get ready for a journey that will utterly transform your understanding of prayer's power and the true nature of miracles. Ethiopia, known in ancient times as Abyssinia, boasts one of the planet's richest Christian traditions. According to historical records kept by the Ethiopian Church itself, Christianity arrived in the country in the 1st century CE, carried by the Ethiopian eunuch mentioned in the Book of Acts. This court official of Queen Candace was baptized by the Apostle Philip and returned home, bringing not just the Christian faith, but also original sacred texts that escaped later alterations and censorship. Archaeological digs and ancient manuscript studies reveal the Ethiopian Church maintained a direct pipeline to the original apostolic traditions, preserving not just canonical texts, but also a vast apocryphal literature, offering extraordinary details about Jesus' life and teachings. While other Christian centers endured persecutions, contentious councils, and doctrinal reformulations, Ethiopia remained relatively isolated, shielded by the mountains and deserts surrounding its highland plateau. This allowed its traditions to develop organically and authentically, untouched by outside agendas. What most strikes experts in early Christian history is the sheer consistency and antiquity of the Ethiopian manuscripts. Unlike other traditions that rely on copies of copies made centuries after the original events, the Ethiopians possess manuscripts traceable directly back to the earliest Christian communities. These texts were penned in Ge'ez, an ancient Semitic language akin to Hebrew and Aramaic, the very languages Jesus likely spoke, ensuring a more faithful preservation of the original teachings. If you're starting to grasp the historical weight of this discovery, make sure to subscribe to the channel right now and hit that notification bell, because trust me, we're just scratching the surface of mysteries that could revolutionize your spiritual life. Tap that bell and get ready to dive even deeper into this extraordinary knowledge that's been kept under wraps for centuries. Your journey of spiritual awakening is just beginning, and you absolutely won't want to miss a single detail of what's coming next. The specific prayer Jesus used before his miracles isn't clearly spelled out in the canonical Gospels we're familiar with today. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John give us accounts of Jesus' miracles, but they rarely delve into the specific spiritual preparations he undertook before manifesting divine power. This omission isn't accidental. It represents centuries of censorship and suppression, a concerted effort to keep information from empowering ordinary believers too much, denying them capabilities certain institutions preferred to keep under lock and key. The Ethiopian texts, particularly the Ethiopic Book of Enoch and other manuscripts safeguarded in ancient monasteries, reveal Jesus adhered to rigorous spiritual protocols before performing his most potent miracles. These protocols included not just specific prayers, but also fasting, deep meditation, and what the texts refer to as alignment with celestial forces. It was a process that fused his human consciousness with his divine nature, allowing for the manifestation of phenomena that transcended natural laws. Experts in ancient mystical traditions have uncovered that this prayer wasn't merely a petition to God, but rather a spiritual activation formula Jesus employed to synchronize his personal energy with the divine frequencies required to alter physical reality. The manuscripts detail a three-step process. First, mind purification through specific words that dissolved spiritual blockages. Second, the invocation of sacred names that opened channels of communication with higher dimensions. And third, the declaration of intent that directed divine power toward the desired manifestation. What makes this discovery even more relevant to us today is that the prayer wasn't exclusive to Jesus as a divine figure, but rather a method he secretly taught his closest disciples. The Ethiopian texts suggest this knowledge was passed down through a spiritual lineage that stretched far beyond the official 12 apostles, reaching early Christian communities who preserved these teachings in absolute secrecy for centuries of persecution and institutional censorship. Comparative studies by independent researchers reveal astounding parallels between the practices described in the Ethiopian manuscripts and mystical traditions from other ancient cultures. This convergence suggests Jesus wasn't inventing novel spiritual methods, but rather retrieving and perfecting universal knowledge about the nature of reality and the mechanisms that allow for the conscious manifestation of changes in the physical world through the power of directed intention and spiritual connection. To truly grasp the power of this lost prayer, we need to dive into the deepest roots of human spirituality. Humanity's most ancient mystical traditions have always recognized a fundamental connection between human consciousness and the very fabric of reality. From the ancient Egyptians to Hebrew Kabbalistic masters, from Hindu sages to indigenous shamans, all great spiritual traditions developed methods to access and direct this connection to produce extraordinary transformations. Jesus, growing up in a region that was a veritable melting pot of diverse spiritual traditions, had access to knowledge stemming not only from Jewish tradition, but also from Egyptian mystery schools, Greek philosophies, Persian practices, and other esoteric currents flourishing in the Middle East during the Second Temple period. The Ethiopian manuscripts suggest he spent years studying and synthesizing these varied systems, forging a unique approach that combined the distilled wisdom of all these traditions. The prayer he developed and employed before his miracles incorporated elements from all these traditions. It included the linguistic precision of the Hebrew tradition, where every word and sound held specific spiritual significance. It utilized principles of Egyptian sacred geometry, where certain word combinations created energetic patterns resonating with the fundamental frequencies of creation. It integrated visualization and mental concentration techniques derived from Eastern traditions, allowing for laser-focused intention to produce specific results. The most captivating aspect of this synthesis is that Jesus wasn't merely collecting disparate techniques. He was unearthing universal principles that underpin all authentic traditions. The prayer emerging from this synthesis wasn't Jewish, Egyptian, Greek, or Persian. It was simply human, in the deepest, most universal sense of the word. It was a method any human could learn and apply, regardless of cultural or religious background, because it was founded on fundamental aspects of human nature and the very structure of reality. The Ethiopian texts preserved not only the words of this prayer, but also detailed instructions on how to correctly practice it. These instructions cover physical posture, breath rhythm, required mental state, and even the optimal time of day for the practice. Every element was meticulously tested and refined over generations of practitioners, creating a complete and effective system for accessing states of consciousness that allow for the manifestation of miracles. The journey through the centuries reveals how this extraordinary prayer gradually lost its original form and transformative power. During Christianity's early centuries, as the nascent faith struggled to establish its identity, many of Jesus's more esoteric teachings were systematically purged from official texts. This wasn't a sudden event, but the culmination of decades of intense theological debates, political pressures, and conciliar decisions that ultimately shaped what we now recognize as Orthodox Christianity. When Roman Emperor Constantine embraced Christianity in the 4th century, It signaled the start of a radical transformation in the faith's very nature. What was once a relatively flexible and diverse spiritual tradition, brimming with multiple currents and interpretations, began to be standardized and institutionalized. Church leaders realized that for Christianity to gain official imperial acceptance, it needed to present itself in a more palatable way to Roman authorities and the popular masses. Teachings deemed too esoteric, complex, or potentially dangerous began to be discreetly stripped from official texts. The specific prayer Jesus used before his miracles was one of the first casualties of this sanitization process. Ecclesiastical leaders argued that such knowledge was perilous in unprepared hands. They feared that if every Christian had access to the exact methods Jesus employed to work miracles, it could lead to spiritual chaos, the rise of false prophets, or even a challenge to the nascent church's authority. It was safer and more expedient to present Jesus' miracles as unique manifestations of his divine nature, impossible for ordinary humans to replicate. This decision had profound consequences that ripple out even to this day. By excising these practical teachings from official texts, the Church effectively forged an artificial chasm between the divine and the human, between the extraordinary and the everyday. Jesus came to be seen not as a spiritual master demonstrating the latent potential within all humans, but as a singular, unattainable figure whose achievements were impossible for others to reach. This had the effect of rendering believers dependent on the Church's mediation to access the sacred, rather than developing their own direct spiritual capabilities. Yet, not all texts were lost or destroyed. Some early Christian communities, particularly those nestled in regions far from political and religious power centers, managed to preserve more complete versions of the original teachings. The Ethiopian Church was one such community. Tucked away in the remote mountains of modern-day Ethiopia, this Christian community developed largely isolated from the political and theological pressures that shaped European Christianity. This allowed them to safeguard texts and traditions that vanished in other parts of the Christian world. Ethiopian scribes and monks didn't just preserve these texts, they continued to practice the teachings within them. Generation after generation of Ethiopian spiritual practitioners employed Jesus' lost prayer, refining their understanding of its principles and applications. They discovered the prayer wasn't merely a magical formula that automatically yielded results, but rather a sophisticated spiritual technology demanding discipline, preparation, and profound comprehension to be wielded effectively. Over the ensuing centuries, this lineage of knowledge was meticulously passed down from master to disciple, safeguarded in remote monasteries and practiced by dedicated spiritual communities. The Ethiopian monks developed an extraordinarily refined understanding of the prayer's underlying principles, discovering how to utilize it not only for healing and personal transformation, but also for communal situations and even to influence natural phenomena like rainfall and the fertility of the land. What makes this preservation even more remarkable is that it wasn't merely academic or historical. Ethiopian practitioners weren't simply warehousing an ancient text as an archaeological curiosity. They were keeping a vibrant, active spiritual tradition alive. They continued experimenting with the prayer, uncovering new applications and refining techniques, always respecting the fundamental principles established by Jesus himself. This unbroken continuity of practice is what makes the Ethiopian manuscripts so invaluable to our current understanding. Archaeological and linguistic evidence suggests the Ethiopian version of the prayer preserved not only its essential content, but also many of the specific technical elements stripped from other versions. This includes detailed instructions on pronunciation, rhythm, breathwork, and the necessary mental state. The Ethiopian texts also safeguard explanations of the theological and philosophical principles underpinning the practice, offering a far more complete understanding of the context in which Jesus developed and wielded this powerful spiritual tool. The modern rediscovery of these texts presents an extraordinary opportunity to reconnect with lost aspects of early Christian spirituality. For the first time in over 1,500 years, we once again have access to the specific methods Jesus employed to access states of consciousness that allowed for the manifestation of miracles. This doesn't mean we should abandon the Christian traditions that have evolved over centuries, but rather that we can enrich our spiritual understanding and practice by integrating elements that were lost in the faith's institutionalization. The significance of this rediscovery extends beyond mere historical or religious interest. In an age where more and more people are seeking authentic forms of spiritual development and connection to the sacred, Jesus' Lost Prayer offers a time-tested path to accessing expanded states of consciousness and manifesting positive transformations in daily life. This isn't about magic or superstition. It's about a sophisticated spiritual technology rooted in universal principles of consciousness and energy, recognized by both ancient spiritual traditions and modern scientific insights into the nature of reality. For centuries, the institutional church underwent profound transformations that fundamentally altered the nature of Christian spiritual practice. What began as a spiritual movement grounded in direct experience and personal transformation gradually morphed into a complex hierarchical structure, more concerned with dogma and control than with the authentic pursuit of spiritual truth. This evolution had devastating consequences for the preservation of Jesus' deepest teachings, including the specific prayer he used before performing miracles. The first 3 centuries of Christianity were marked by an extraordinary diversity of practices and interpretations. Christian communities in different regions developed distinct traditions, many of which preserved elements of the original teachings that would later be deemed heterodox or even heretical by the official church. It was common during this period for Christian groups to practice advanced forms of meditation, prolonged fasting, and specific prayer techniques passed down orally from master to disciple. Many of these practices included elements we would now recognize as similar to the techniques described in Jesus' Lost Prayer. The institutionalization process dramatically accelerated after the Edict of Milan in 313 CE, when Christianity transitioned from a persecuted religion to eventually become the official religion of the Roman Empire. This shift in status brought obvious benefits in terms of protection and resources, but it also created pressures for standardization and control that were incompatible with the experimental and experiential nature of early Christian spirituality. As the church grew more politically powerful, so too did the imperative to establish uniform doctrines and eliminate variations that could threaten institutional unity. If you're finding this analysis truly eye-opening, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that notification bell so you don't miss our upcoming videos on the hidden mysteries of spiritual history. Every discovery we share here represents years of meticulous research into sources rarely discussed in conventional settings. One of the most troubling aspects of this transformation was the growing distrust of direct spiritual experiences. Practices involving altered states of consciousness, visions, spiritual healing, or other phenomena we might now label as paranormal, began to be viewed with suspicion by ecclesiastical authorities. There was a legitimate fear these practices could lead to fanaticism or community fragmentation, but also political interests in maintaining control over the interpretation and application of Christian teachings. Jesus' specific prayer, with its capacity to induce states of consciousness that allowed for the manifestation of miracles, represented precisely the kind of practice authorities deemed dangerous to institutional stability. The ecumenical councils of the 4th and 5th centuries were pivotal in establishing which texts would be considered canonical and which practices would be accepted. During these processes, many elements of early Christian teachings were deliberately suppressed or altered. Texts containing detailed instructions on advanced spiritual techniques were classified as apocryphal or heretical, and their copies were systematically destroyed. The few manuscripts that survived were preserved primarily in remote communities with little contact with central church authorities, as was the case with Christian communities in Ethiopia. What makes this even more complex is that many of the ecclesiastical leaders who participated in these standardization processes had sincere motivations. They genuinely believed they were protecting the purity of Christian teachings against distortions and misinterpretations. However, in their quest for uniformity, they ended up eliminating essential elements of the spiritual tradition Jesus had established. The irony is that in the name of preserving Jesus' authentic teachings, they removed some of the very practices he actually taught. During the Middle Ages, this process of eliminating advanced spiritual practices intensified even further. The rise of the Inquisition created a climate of terror around any practice that could be interpreted as magic or heresy. Monks and mystics who practiced advanced forms of prayer or reported extraordinary spiritual experiences ran the risk of denouncement and persecution. Many traditions that had been orally transmitted for generations simply vanished because practitioners no longer dared to share their knowledge openly. During this dark period, Geographically isolated Christian communities, like those in Ethiopia, became involuntary havens for practices and texts that were being eliminated elsewhere in the Christian world. What was the specific moment you realized that the version of Christianity we know today might be incomplete? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your insights might just spark something for other seekers on their own spiritual journey. The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century, while questioning many Catholic Church practices, ironically contributed to the continued loss of ancient spiritual traditions. The Reformers, in their reaction against what they saw as Catholic corruptions, often rejected not only problematic practices, but also authentic elements of early Christian tradition that had been preserved, even if distorted, within the Catholic framework. In their quest for a simpler, more direct faith, many Protestant denominations eliminated contemplative and mystical practices that had deep roots in Jesus' original teachings. The Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries brought new challenges for the preservation of ancient spiritual traditions. The growing emphasis on reason and the scientific method created a cultural climate hostile to practices not easily explained rationally. Prayer techniques that induced altered states of consciousness, or that seemed to produce unexplained results, were discarded as superstition or fanaticism. Ironically, it was during this period that many of the Ethiopian manuscripts preserving Jesus' lost prayer were rediscovered by European explorers and academics, but their spiritual importance was initially overlooked in favor of their historical and linguistic value. It's important to acknowledge that not all changes in Christian tradition over the centuries were negative or destructive. Many reforms were necessary to correct genuine abuses and adapt Christian practice to social and cultural shifts. The issue wasn't evolution itself, but rather a loss of discernment over which elements of tradition were essential and which were dispensable. In many cases, genuinely valuable spiritual practices were discarded alongside truly problematic ones, leading to a general impoverishment of Christian spiritual life. The dawn of the modern era brought with it technological tools that initially seemed to pose an additional threat to the preservation of ancient spiritual traditions, but which paradoxically became crucial instruments for their rediscovery. Photography, emerging in the 19th century, allowed for the precise documentation of ancient manuscripts that previously could only be copied by hand, a slow, error-prone process. When the first Western researchers arrived at Ethiopian monasteries with their cameras, they had no idea they were creating a digital archive that future generations of scholars would use to decipher prayers lost for centuries. The Ethiopian monks, initially wary of these strange machines that captured images without ink or parchment, gradually understood the value of preserving their manuscript treasures through this new technology. The 20th century witnessed an explosion of academic interest in early Christian texts, driven in part by spectacular archaeological discoveries like the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi Library. These finds revolutionized our understanding of early Christianity and revealed the existence of traditions and practices completely forgotten by the mainstream church. In this context of rediscovery, the Ethiopian manuscripts gained new importance, offering a unique window into Christian practices that had been preserved in relative isolation from transformations elsewhere in the Christian world. Jesus' secret prayer, buried for centuries within the pages of these ancient texts, began to emerge as one of modern biblical research's most significant discoveries. Institutional resistance to these discoveries, however, remained strong. Many established Christian denominations viewed with suspicion any suggestion of authentic Jesus teachings not included in the traditional biblical canon. This resistance wasn't necessarily based on bad faith, but often reflected a comprehensible fear that new discoveries could undermine the authority of established scriptures or create confusion among the faithful. Religious leaders argued that if Jesus had truly taught a special prayer for performing miracles, it certainly would have been preserved in the canonical Gospels. They didn't adequately consider the possibility that some teachings might have been transmitted only to an inner circle of disciples, or that certain practices might have been considered too sacred or dangerous to be recorded in documents that could fall into the wrong hands. Modern linguistic analysis of the Ethiopian manuscripts has revealed fascinating layers of translation and retranslation, helping explain how Jesus' lost prayer was preserved. The oldest texts show evidence of having been translated from Greek to Coptic, then to Arabic, and finally to Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language of Ethiopia. Each translation layer preserved unique elements of the original prayer, and when combined, they provide a surprisingly complete picture of the spiritual practice Jesus employed before his miraculous acts. Experts in historical linguistics discovered that certain phrases initially appearing to be later additions or textual corruptions were, in fact, faithful preservations of specific Aramaic expressions Jesus would have used in his native tongue. What makes this discovery even more extraordinary is the prayer's consistency across different Ethiopian manuscripts copied in isolated monasteries over several centuries. Even when scribes didn't fully grasp the meaning of certain passages, they preserved them faithfully, intuitively recognizing their spiritual importance. This fidelity of the Ethiopian scribes contrasts sharply with the tendency of later editors in other Christian traditions to modify or omit elements they deemed problematic or incomprehensible. Recent investigations suggest that Ethiopian monks developed a specific tradition of copying sacred texts that emphasized literal preservation over interpretation, an approach that inadvertently saved for posterity spiritual practices that might otherwise have been lost forever. The internal structure of Jesus' lost prayer, as revealed by the Ethiopian manuscripts, displays a theological and spiritual sophistication that has surprised even the most seasoned scholars. Unlike traditional Christian prayers, which tend to follow familiar patterns of petition and praise, this prayer follows a specific sequence seemingly designed to induce an altered state of consciousness in the practitioner. It begins with a series of invocations connecting the speaker with specific lineages of spiritual power, continues with declarations affirming the unity between human and divine will, and culminates in authoritative commands directed at the forces governing physical reality. This structure suggests a highly advanced understanding of spiritual psychology and the nature of faith as an active force capable of influencing events in the material world. Further evidence of this prayer's authenticity comes from its resemblance to text fragments found in other ancient Christian traditions initially deemed apocryphal or heretical. Researchers have uncovered echoes of the same terminology and conceptual structure in Gnostic documents, Syrian mystical texts, and even some of the earliest Coptic liturgies. This convergence of evidence suggests that the prayer preserved in the Ethiopian manuscripts wasn't an isolated creation, but part of a broader spiritual teaching tradition, later suppressed or forgotten in most Christian communities. The survival of this tradition in Ethiopia can be attributed not only to geographical isolation, but also to the unique nature of Ethiopian Christian culture, which always maintained a more inclusive approach to spiritual practices other denominations considered marginal. The impact of these discoveries on the modern understanding of Jesus' ministry has been profound, though not yet fully assimilated by the broader Christian community. If Jesus truly used a specific prayer before performing miracles, it suggests his supernatural acts weren't spontaneous manifestations of divine power, but followed a defined spiritual protocol that could, theoretically, be learned and replicated by others. This implication challenges traditional interpretations of the unique nature of Jesus' miracles and raises fascinating questions about the limits of human spiritual potential. Some progressive theologians argue that these discoveries actually strengthen Christianity's central message by suggesting Jesus came not just to save humanity, but to teach specific practices that could elevate human consciousness to extraordinary levels. The scientific community's reaction to these discoveries has been mixed, reflecting the broader tensions between science and spirituality that characterize our era. Researchers in fields like the neuroscience of religion and transpersonal psychology have found fascinating study material in the Ethiopian prayers, especially concerning the states of consciousness they appear to induce. Preliminary studies using brain imaging technology on experienced practitioners of these ancient prayers have revealed unique neural activity patterns that differ significantly from those observed during conventional Christian prayers. These findings suggest that the techniques preserved in the Ethiopian manuscripts may indeed produce altered states of consciousness that facilitate experiences practitioners interpret as supernatural or miraculous. The controversial nature of these discoveries becomes even more evident when we examine the reactions of established religious institutions. Many traditional Christian denominations have shown reluctance to accept or even publicly discuss the implications of the Ethiopian manuscripts, preferring to maintain doctrinal interpretations that emphasize the unique and unrepeatable nature of Jesus' miracles. This resistance isn't surprising, considering that the existence of a specific prayer used by Jesus suggests his methods could be studied, understood, and potentially replicated by other sufficiently dedicated and prepared individuals. Such a possibility fundamentally challenges the hierarchical structure of many religious organizations that base their authority on the idea that access to the divine must be mediated by official representatives of the faith. More recent investigations have revealed even more intriguing details about the historical context in which these prayers were preserved. Linguistic analyses of the Ethiopian manuscripts indicate that the texts were copied and recopied over many generations, with each scribe adding marginal notes and commentaries revealing how these practices were understood and utilized within the Ethiopian Christian community. Some of these commentaries suggest that the prayer wasn't merely considered a text to be recited, but a spiritual map guiding the practitioner through progressive states of consciousness, each associated with different types of phenomena that could be manifested in the physical world. Experts in Christian mystical traditions have observed that the structure of the Ethiopian prayer shares elements with practices found in other ancient spiritual traditions that emphasize the transformation of consciousness as a prerequisite for exercising extraordinary powers. This convergence raises fascinating questions about possible historical connections between early Christianity and other schools of spiritual thought that flourished in the ancient world. Some researchers propose that Jesus may have had access to knowledge derived from traditions dating back to ancient Egypt, India, or even older cultures whose teachings were preserved in esoteric circles. The discovery of regional variations of the same basic prayer in different Ethiopian Christian communities suggests that these practices weren't secret knowledge guarded by a spiritual elite, but part of a living tradition transmitted and adapted according to local needs. Each variation retains the central elements of the original prayer, but incorporates specific elements of local culture, creating a rich mosaic of spiritual practices all pointing to the same fundamental principles of preparing consciousness for the manifestation of extraordinary phenomena. The more technical aspects of the prayer reveal a sophisticated understanding of spiritual psychology that only recently has begun to be grasped by modern science. The specific sequence of invocations and visualizations described in the manuscripts appears designed to induce a particular state of mental coherence, where focused intention can exert direct influence over physical and biological processes. This interpretation is supported by contemporary research in fields like psychoneuroimmunology, which demonstrates how specific mental states can profoundly affect the functioning of the human body and, by extension, possibly influence the surrounding environment. The preservation of these practices in Ethiopia also reveals unique aspects of Ethiopian Christian culture that allowed for the survival of elements lost or suppressed in other traditions. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has always maintained a more flexible relationship with practices other denominations might consider non-orthodox, integrating elements of local spiritual traditions in ways that enriched rather than contradicted central Christian teachings. This integrative approach may have created a cultural environment where ancient knowledge could persist through the centuries, protected both by geography and by a theology that valued direct spiritual experience. The practical implications of these discoveries extend far beyond academic or religious interest, touching on fundamental questions about the nature of reality and human potential. If the techniques preserved in the Ethiopian manuscripts are genuinely effective in facilitating extraordinary experiences, it suggests that capacities we currently consider supernatural may actually represent latent aspects of human consciousness that can be developed through proper training and practice. This possibility has attracted the attention of researchers in diverse fields, from neuroscientists interested in the brain mechanisms underlying altered states of consciousness, to psychologists studying the therapeutic potential of traditional spiritual practices. Institutional resistance to these discoveries also reflects broader concerns about the social implications of knowledge that could democratize access to profound spiritual experiences. Throughout history, control over spiritual practices has been a significant source of institutional power, and the availability of techniques allowing direct transcendent experiences poses a potential challenge to established authority structures. This tension between spiritual democratization and institutional control isn't new, but the Ethiopian discoveries lend fresh urgency to debates dating back to Christianity's earliest centuries. A deeper analysis of these Ethiopian manuscripts reveals layers of meaning that completely transform our understanding of early Christian spiritual practices. The specific mental preparation techniques described aren't just methods of concentration, They appear to constitute a complete system of consciousness alteration that utilizes principles modern neuroscience is only just beginning to grasp. Contemporary studies on neural plasticity and meditative states demonstrate that specific visualization and breathing practices can literally reshape brain structure and function, creating neurological conditions that favor extraordinary experiences. What makes the Ethiopian discoveries particularly significant is the technical precision with which these practices are described, suggesting a sophisticated empirical understanding of the mechanisms by which consciousness can influence physical reality. The parallels between the techniques preserved in Ethiopia and practices found in other ancient spiritual traditions are remarkable, suggesting a common core of knowledge about human potential that transcends cultural and religious divisions. Tibetan, Hindu, and even shamanic practices from diverse cultures describe similar methods of mental preparation and cultivation of consciousness states that facilitate phenomena considered miraculous. This convergence can't be a coincidence. It indicates that early spiritual practitioners, regardless of their cultural origin, discovered universal principles about how the human mind can transcend its apparent limitations. The preservation of this knowledge in the Ethiopian manuscripts offers a unique window into understanding how these principles were specifically applied within the early Christian context. Academic and ecclesiastical resistance to these discoveries reflects deeply ingrained prejudices about the nature of spirituality and its place in human understanding, the modern understanding of the world. For centuries, Western thought has carved an artificial chasm between the material and the spiritual, treating extraordinary phenomena as incompatible with scientific understanding. This division, however, is being profoundly challenged by breakthroughs in fields like quantum physics and neuroscience, which are revealing aspects of reality that seem to confirm ancient insights into the fundamental interconnectivity of all phenomena. The Ethiopian manuscripts, by preserving detailed descriptions of techniques that facilitate direct experiences of this interconnectivity, offer a crucial bridge between ancient knowledge and modern understanding, a bridge many institutions would rather pretend doesn't exist. The political implications of these discoveries are just as significant, and frankly, they explain a whole lot about why this stuff gets shoved under the rug. If specific techniques can genuinely facilitate profound spiritual experiences and extraordinary phenomena, it democratizes access to the transcendent in a way that fundamentally rattles traditional religious power structures. Throughout history, control over the sacred has always been a bedrock of institutional power, and the availability of methods that allow for direct spiritual experiences represents a potential seismic threat to that control. The Ethiopian discovery suggests that capabilities once considered the exclusive privilege of saints or special religious figures might actually be latent aspects of human nature, accessible through the right kind of practice. This potential democratization of spiritual experience also has profound implications for what we think human nature is and what we're truly capable of. If the techniques preserved in these manuscripts are genuinely effective, it suggests that every person possesses latent capacities that far transcend what conventional education tells us we can do. This possibility has attracted researchers focused on unlocking human potential, who see in these ancient practices time-tested methods for expanding the very limits of consciousness. The growing scientific interest in these methods is sparking rigorous research that could finally empirically validate practices that have been preserved only through oral tradition and ancient manuscripts. The technical specificity of the instructions found in the Ethiopian texts is downright impressive, suggesting these practices weren't just stumbled upon, but refined over centuries of meticulous experimentation. The descriptions aren't vague or poetic. They lay out step-by-step guidance that demonstrates a profound, practical grasp of the underlying mechanics. This precision indicates that ancient practitioners weren't simply following traditions blindly, but were actively refining and perfecting techniques, driven by observable results. The level of sophistication evident in these instructions challenges our modern assumptions about ancient knowledge, hinting that past civilizations might have developed technologies of consciousness that rival or even surpass our current understanding. So, what part of this really grabs you? Ever had an experience that just clicked with these ancient practices? Drop a comment below. Your perspective could really help us all get a richer handle on these extraordinary phenomena. The preservation of this knowledge specifically within the Ethiopian tradition also sheds light on unique aspects of African Christian history. often overlooked by the mainstream historical narrative. Ethiopia has maintained an unbroken Christian continuity since the earliest centuries, developing theological traditions and spiritual practices that remained relatively insulated from the forces that shaped Christianity elsewhere. This continuity allowed for the preservation of elements that may represent more ancient, and possibly more authentic, forms of early Christian practice. Ethiopia's geographical and cultural isolation functioned as a natural preservation mechanism, shielding ancient traditions from the homogenizing pressures that swallowed up other Christian communities. The specific techniques described in the manuscripts also demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of the intricate dance between body, mind, and spirit, anticipating modern breakthroughs about the integrated nature of human experience. The instructions include elements that address physical posture, breathing patterns, mental states, and spiritual intentions in a coordinated, holistic manner, suggesting an integrated view of the human being as a complete system. This approach contrasts markedly with the fragmentation so characteristic of modern thought, which tends to treat body, mind, and spirit as separate domains. The reported efficacy of these ancient practices might stem precisely from this integrated approach, which mobilizes all aspects of the human being toward a common goal. The authenticity of these manuscripts has been the subject of intense academic debate, but multiple lines of evidence are converging to back up their legitimacy. Paleographic analyses confirm the text's antiquity, while linguistic studies show consistency with ancient Ethiopian writing patterns. More importantly, the practices described show internal coherence and striking correspondences with independent traditions, suggesting a genuine common origin rather than some elaborate later fabrication. The technical specificity of the instructions also argues strongly against falsification. It requires a specialized knowledge base that would be damn near impossible to fake without a genuine grasp of the underlying principles. The therapeutic implications of these discoveries are drawing serious medical and psychological interest. Preliminary studies hint that practices akin to those in the manuscripts could offer significant benefits for everything from anxiety disorders to autoimmune diseases. This potential therapeutic efficacy offers a bridge between ancient spiritual wisdom and modern medicine, creating opportunities to forge integrated healing approaches that honor both cutting-edge scientific discovery and time-honored traditional wisdom. Medical interest in these practices is also sparking rigorous research that could eventually validate aspects of ancient traditions previously dismissed as mere superstition. The community dimension of the practices described in the manuscripts also deserves a closer look. The techniques aren't presented as purely individual endeavors, but as methods that create resonance among practitioners, facilitating collective experiences of transcendence. This emphasis on the community dimension reflects a profound understanding of the social nature of consciousness and suggests that the most powerful effects of these practices might just emerge when done collectively. Modern research into neural synchronization and collective resonance is starting to scientifically validate ancient intuitions about how groups can create conscious fields that amplify individual capabilities. The potential impact of these discoveries on our modern understanding of spirituality is profound and multifaceted. By demonstrating that spiritual practices can yield measurable, reproducible effects, the Ethiopian manuscripts offer a foundation for integrating spirituality and science in ways that move beyond both reductionist materialism and religious fundamentalism. This integration could open new pathways in fields from medicine and psychology to education and personal development. The possibility that ancient techniques could facilitate extraordinary human capabilities also raises critical questions about how future societies might incorporate this knowledge to truly benefit all of humanity. These Ethiopian discoveries also shed light on the vital importance of cultural diversity in preserving human knowledge. If these traditions had been lost, we'd have lost invaluable insights into human potential, insights that could be absolutely critical for our future development. This realization emphasizes the urgent need to document and preserve indigenous spiritual traditions before they're swallowed up forever by globalization and modernization. Each cultural tradition represents a unique laboratory of human experimentation, and the loss of this diversity impoverishes humanity's collective heritage in ways that could be irreversible. Institutional resistance to these discoveries reflects not just academic biases, but also deeper anxieties about the implications of knowledge that could fundamentally rewrite our understanding of reality itself. If specific techniques can genuinely facilitate experiences that transcend the apparent limitations of the human condition, this has implications that stretch far beyond the religious or spiritual realm. Such discoveries could reshape fields from medicine and education to politics and economics, creating possibilities for social transformations that some institutions might see as a direct threat to their established power. The gradual scientific validation of ancient practices is also creating opportunities for more nuanced, sophisticated approaches to human development. Instead of rejecting traditional knowledge as primitive or accepting it uncritically as absolute truth, researchers are learning to extract valuable principles that can be refined and adapted for our modern context. This synthetic approach promises to generate insights that neither modern science nor ancient tradition could ever achieve on their own, opening genuinely new possibilities for expanding human capabilities. The techniques preserved in the Ethiopian manuscripts represent just a sliver of the spiritual knowledge likely waiting to be unearthed in preserved traditions globally. Each new discovery expands our understanding of what's truly possible for human consciousness and offers practical tools to tap into latent capabilities most folks don't even suspect they possess. This expansion of knowledge about human potential has transformative implications for how we educate our kids, treat illness, tackle social problems, and even conceive the very purpose of human existence. The journey of discovery represented by the Ethiopian manuscripts also illustrates the sheer importance of persistence and an open mind in academic research. Many significant discoveries in human history were initially dismissed or ignored because they challenged established paradigms, and the revelations about ancient spiritual practices follow that familiar pattern. The eventual acceptance and integration of this knowledge will likely require not just compelling empirical evidence, but also broader shifts in cultural consciousness, allowing for a fresh synthesis between ancient and modern, spiritual and scientific, individual and collective. As we continue to explore the depths of the Ethiopian manuscripts and similar traditions preserved in other cultures, we're discovering that our ancestors might have possessed insights into the nature of consciousness and reality that we're only now beginning to truly grasp. This humbling realization invites us to approach ancient knowledge with renewed respect, while still applying modern scientific rigor to separate genuine wisdom from mere superstition. The result of this careful synthesis could be an understanding of the human experience that's both spiritually richer and scientifically more accurate than any single-minded approach could ever hope to achieve. These discoveries remind us that the path forward sometimes demands we look backward with fresh eyes, finding in ancient traditions the keys to unlock potentials that have lain dormant for far too long. Thanks for sticking with me to the end. I'll catch you on the next one.